Many Magic the Gathering players might have heard the term your graveyard being an extension of your hand, and that's not just referring to Snapcaster Mage reusing counter spells or flashback spells in your graveyard. It is referring to Dredge as a mechanic, Magic the Gathering's most infamous graveyard mechanic, one that rates so high up on the Storm scale we will probably never get it in Standard ever, because it's a mechanic that honestly the original creators of it didn't realize how broken it was, didn't realize how busted it was. And not only with some of the old cards that have existed, but to this day, they've still leaned into it with a lot of recent additions to Magic's most powerful graveyard archetype. And in today's video, I wanted to provide an introduction to all of you. Maybe some of you have played Dredge in Pauper or in Modern or in Legacy or whatever it might be, but may not have explored other archetypes, other Dredge decks in different formats, and may not realize how much they flow in between each other, how many similarities there are. And so I'm hoping to give you that taste. Even if you're an outsider and you're looking in and you're maybe interested, maybe I can get you a little interested in Magic's most broken and really intuitive and unintuitive archetype out there. Casting spells and getting free value without even casting spells, Dredge is the mechanic for you if you want to do loopy things, but each archetype does it a little bit differently. So I think the best way to start things off to explain the graveyard shenanigans that you can get is really just with a little bit of a description. Now, this description is straight out of the MTG Wiki. Dredge is a keyword attributed to the Golgari back in the Ravnica block. And now this is important because, largely speaking, there aren't any blue Dredge cards. There might be like payoffs and stuff, but there aren't any blue cards with the words Dredge on them. That's going to be very important to note later down the line when it comes to like deck building. But Dredge is a recursion mechanic where the owner of the card in the graveyard with Dredge can return the card to their hand by choosing to skip their draw and mill cards equal to the Dredge number. So for example, if you have a card like Stinkweed Imp that has Dredge 5, instead of drawing a card, any instance that you would draw a card, by the way, not just on your draw step, if you have a literal spell that says draw a card, instead of drawing that card, you can choose to Dredge, returning that Stinkweed Imp, dredging it out of your graveyard, taking it out of your graveyard, and then milling equal to the number on it. So if it's Dredge 5, you bring the Stinkweed Imp back instead of that draw and mill 5 cards. So very easily you can see how you can start to fill your graveyard. But why would you want to do that? This used to be a downside. A lot of these creatures are very weakly statted. They have abilities on them. Stinkweed Imp has like a weird death touch mechanic, but it's not really death touch because it needs to be combat damage. But there are like weird balancing factors on them. So what about them makes them so powerful? The number written on each Dredge card. So Dredge only appears in green or in black cards except for the land Dakmor Salvage from Future Sight, Keyword Land Cycle, and Shenanigans from Modern Horizons. Shenanigans being a red card. Dredge rates near Storm as an unsalvageable mechanic on the Storm scale. The mechanic is inherently repetitive, and while Dredge value is intended to scale with power, costing more to mill the more powerful cards, it went the opposite way. The low number cards can be constantly rebought, while the high number cards are ones that are never cast, but instead used to fuel over and over again. So for example, something like a 1-cost Dredge spell, yeah, you do cast that over and over again, right? There are examples of that, but the higher number Dredge cards, you are constantly just dredging and filling your yard over and over again. You don't need to cast the Dredge 5 Stinkweed Imp, although there are situations where you do actually end up casting it in grindy situations. As a consequence, changing the mana cost of Dredge spells does not do much to its playability, making it impossible to balance. Exactly, like it's not really about the converted mana cost. When your graveyard is an extension of your hand and you're getting a lot of value for free, heck, you're not even casting spells to get creatures out for free. I mean, sometimes you are in older formats, but sometimes they're just entering for free, and that's the problem. So Dredge is a static ability. Dredge N means as long as there are N cards in your library, if you would draw a card, you may instead mill N cards. So for example, if you have 4 cards left in your library, you can't Dredge 5. You can't go all the way down to 0. You have to be able to dredge to the amount that exists. Now let's go over some Dredge basics. Now, first and foremost here, there are some similarities across all of the Dredge archetypes. And the first one that I want to talk about is that, again, there are no blue Dredge cards. And what that means for older formats is that you don't have any ability to use the Dredge cards to pitch to something like Force of Will or Force of Negation, also in the modern format. So that's going to be relevant there. Most of the mana bases tend to require blue and black, but also red as well for a lot of the aggressive payoffs that you need to draw cards. The blue tends to be for some payoff card draw to enable the dredge creatures. The black tends to be for hard casting some of the dredge spells, and the red tends to be for the more aggressive card selection, card draw, discard combination cards that you need. But largely there are no blue dredge cards. The next one that I want to talk about is card draw versus card selection. Now, let me know in the comment section down below if you like this style of format where we go over some specific notes. But card draw versus card selection. So card draw would be something like Preordain, right? 1 mana, you get a little scry, you draw a card, right? You replace the card. Now, card selection is largely suited for cards that replace itself, right? So whether your card negative or your card even, something like Faithless suiting is largely card selection. Sure, it's card draw, but a lot of people prefer to refer to card draw specifically in the context of Magic or in TCGs when you're positive on cards. Card selection tends to be something like Faithless looting, where you draw 2 cards, but you have to discard 2 cards. There's something happening to those cards, or whether you put them back on top of your deck or whatever, maybe with other effects. But for now, card selection is drawing 2 cards and putting them away. Now, sometimes there are situations where you want to put cards back on top or at the bottom of your deck, but for now, we really want to feed our yard. So card selection actually ends up being really powerful as well. As long as it's drawing you cards and you're able to select for the things you want, especially in the early game when you need a little bit of selection to feed your graveyard. And then once you're fed your graveyard, the draw part of it largely doesn't matter. The next part is recursion. So it's all about threats that constantly keep coming back, even in the Pauper Dredge deck, where a lot of these dredge cards aren't necessarily, I mean, they're legal, right? Like Stinkweed Imp is a legal card in Pauper. You may not see it as often or used as aggressively as you see it in Modern, Legacy, and Vintage, where Dredge 5 is more commonly abused through really strong, powerful card draw spells. You just don't have the payoffs, but you do have some ability to return cards from your graveyard for free. So that recursion may cost some amount of mana, but a lot of times it's free value, cards entering for a cheap cost or for free because something else returned. Recursion is a staple amongst all dredge archetypes, whether the cards are coming from your graveyard back to your hand, being discarded, then back to your hand. That's a form of recursion, but also entering the battlefield, getting killed, re-entering the battlefield based on conditions being met. That is also important when it comes to recursion. Now, free value is something that also comes alongside this. So not only is it about a recursion to your hand, but that free value is speaking on spells that necessarily, don't necessarily require a mana cost is what I'm trying to say. Whether it be flashback that requires you to sacrifice a creature, something that you can just flashback from your graveyard so you don't even need it in your hand. That's what I would consider a level of free value. So things like that, being able to enter the battlefield even without being countered is also free value. So something like that is really important because you're operating on an axis that's completely different. You're operating at an inherent disadvantage by not having cards in your hand and not actively, going land spell, and having that interaction. You have to have some type of free explosive value to make up for that. Now, that inherent downside is really important to speak on because it kind of ties into the speed of these decks. Now, speed is really important because a lot of these decks need to act really fast. They need to enable a lot of things together, whether it be, you gain a little bit of life and a silver smoke ghoul re-enters the battlefield, or a bunch of Narcomoebas enter and then you have prized Amalgams coming in. You need to get your opponent dead really fast. And something like a Creeping Chill really changed the game on that. It fundamentally changed the dredge game, which we're going to talk about. But speed is important because over time, opponents can establish maybe that life gain spell that they needed, that one of main board piece that they have for your graveyard deck. You need to be able to beat that. And especially when it comes to post board games, sometimes your opponents have that one piece of hate or that second piece of hate, and you're able to deal with that. But maybe that dealing with that is temporary. And once you deal with it, you need to make sure you're off and able to circumvent that, get your value before that hate piece comes back down. And that's where the easy to hate part of the dredge archetype comes in as well. Ultimately, the dredge deck being primarily about graveyards, really only about graveyards, it's very easy to hate out, and rightfully so. Because of how fast it is, how much free value it is only fair that one single graveyard spell that says exile all cards in a graveyard, or shuffle a graveyard away, or take out certain pieces of a graveyard, it only makes sense that a card like that can be so easy to use and have its own applications for the player controlling it. For example, cards like Soul Guy Lantern, if you don't need to exile the graveyard, it can actually just come in, maybe ping something, but also redraw a card should you need that and your opponent's graveyard isn't going off. You even have something like Relic of Progenitus in the Pauper format that not only exiles graveyards, but draws you a card once you do that. Nihil Spellbomb as well. You have so many different options for these cards that they just do a lot more these days. Graveyard Hate used to be a lot simpler or maybe non-existent, but now with the dredge mechanic, it's all about optionality. So you have to be ready not only to be super fast, use up that free value, but also be ready because you are easy to hate out. Now, these are the common factors across all dredge archetypes. The next piece that I want to talk about is really going into the archetypes themselves. We're going to break down dredge across 4 different formats. And firstly, we're going to go over the Pauper format. Pauper is very interesting because you have some of the common dredge pieces, but you may not have the payoffs for them. And that's the key. You have a way to dredge through your deck, but you don't have the Narcomoebas, the prized amalgams, the payoffs that you get in Legacy, Vintage, and Modern. So how does Pauper Dredge work? Well, this is the list itself, largely Golgari as we see, with a little bit of sideboard options as well. You know, you have some Ancient Grudges with Flashback. Again, that free value where a card in the sideboard is also really powerful. Ray of Revolution, shout out to this card as well. I remember this back when, you know, Pauper Bogles was a big thing, but you know, enchantments are really powerful now as well. And so having the ability to fill your graveyard, maybe with something like Blanchwood Prowler, mill 3 cards if you put a land card from among them into your hand, and then if you don't, put a 1/1 counter on it. So giving you a little bit of value, a 2-mana 2/2 bear. Otherwise, you feed your graveyard a little bit. And then you have some payoffs. So largely we're looking at Exhume. This is your form of recursion, your reanimation spell, if you will. Now Exhume is mirrored. So in the mirror, this can be really interesting, where you don't necessarily want to rip out an Exhume into the blind in grave 2 when you in game 2 when you know what's happening, because your opponent can maybe put something into their graveyard at instant speed, maybe cycle something like a Troll of Khazad-dûm for a swamp, and all of a sudden the Exhume is getting the same value for you and them. Now this is a sorcery, so if you Exhume, it'd be on your turn. Your opponent puts a Troll of Khazad-dûm on there, guess what? They're swinging with that 6/7 first with Mega Menace. So very careful with something like Exhume, but it has that power of something like a lot of decks aren't really filling their graveyard like that. You have that advantage. You could maybe cycle that Troll of Khazad-dûm at the end of your turn. You know, if you're on the play, untap, Exhume, you're off to the races with a 6/7. Exhume is the more common one. It allows you to put any creature, not a random creature, not the top creature or anything like that. But the next one, one of the best ones, is going to be Dread Return. This is a great way to use like tokens or cards that maybe aren't able to like sink through in terms of damage. And in many Eternal formats, we're looking at Legacy and in Vintage, Dread Return being banned in Modern. We're looking at Dread Return as a recursive piece that ends up being there for combo wins. Think of like Oops All Spells, where you have no lands in your deck, you mill out your whole deck with something like a Balustrade Spy, you then cast Dread Return through some Narcomoebas re-entering, so you sacrifice the Balustrade Spy to Narcomoebas, you reanimate a Thassa's Oracle, and you win the game from there. Now, Dread Return in the Pauper format can reanimate something like a Lot-Led Giant. So again, that recursion, that value, this, you know, the flashback, you may cast this for black and 2, but a lot of times you put in your graveyard, this is a free spell because you're only sacrificing creatures that are quote unquote potentially coming back for free or very little, very little cost. And then you're able to turn that into something big like a Lot-Led Giant. Now, what's great about the Pauper deck is that with Burn being at the top of the metagame and so many decks being super fast, that Knot of the Bone naturally is just this main board answer that just lights out against certain decks. So Knot of the Bone, you gain 2 life for each creature in your graveyard. You can start to imagine, like, if you put like 5 cards into your graveyard, 5 creature cards, this is 3 mana, gain 10 life. In a format where Burn is over 15% of the metagame, usually over 10, like Burn is everywhere in the Pauper format. So something like Knot of the Bone being 3 to cast and 3 to flashback for the same value is insane. And as you continue to fill up your graveyard, you can just completely take the game out of reach of not only the Burn decks, but a lot of combo decks as well. So for example, something like Pauper Cycle Storm, which is very popular. Heck, even the affinity decks, which still do rely on kind of combat combat on the board, you can wholly circumvent all of that with cards like Knot of the Bone. So having these payoffs are really important. So this is that main board anti-meta payoff that's really powerful in a format that's so combat focused. Stuff like this is really important in Pauper Dredge. The more recent addition is something like Malevolent Rumble, where you look at the top 4 for a permanent, create a 0/1, so it functionally costs 1, but then the other 3 cards that you looked for enter your graveyard. So it's a great way to just fill your yard up. Generous and ends up being this great cycler to be able to get your lands. That's why you're paying so little. Essentially, if you have 1 land in one of these, you functionally have 2 lands in your hand, and a great way to feed your yard. Stinkweed Imp, as I've been mentioning for a little bit, we're going to see Stinkweed Imp kind of carry through all archetypes here. Being common here. Unearth from the Scrapwort Mutt as a way to get recursion out of your graveyard, but also as a form of card selection, discarding a card, drawing a card, feeding your graveyard, maybe even dredging. Instead of drawing Dredge the Stinkweed and feed your graveyard. Satyr Wayfinder, looking at the top 4 cards, getting a land, putting the rest in their graveyard, and then ultimately you're using stuff like Exhume, Knot of the Bone, and Dread Return to return probably like, again, Troll of Khazad-dûm for combat, or Lot-Led Giant. If you can't swing through on a very gummed up board, Lot-Led Giant is going to be able to kind of do that for you. And then you have great kind of sideboard options here. Knot of the Bone for that extra hate against burn. Fang Dragon is just like a great way, sweep deals 1 damage to each creature you don't control. So this is just like a hate spell for from a giant body, and then if this giant body dies, yeah, it's a 6/3, you can very easily kind of return it back and everything. It's a great threat overall. So that is Pauper Dredge. We see a little bit of it's a slower pace, but it has some big bombastic payoffs in the Lot-Led Giant, the free value in the Dread Return. But we're gonna have to leave Dread Return behind for now to talk about Modern. Now in the Modern format, this is probably the form of Dredge that many of you are more aware of. When it comes to this, really it's defined by Faithless Looting, more recently unbanned. Before that, there was actually an era for about a month or so where Dredge was really popular, because in the One Ring days, not a lot of graveyard decks were at the top. People weren't playing Endurances, and so Dredge was able to get away with things for free. People weren't playing a whole graveyard hate. They're playing maybe some spot removal, so we could get there. But now with old Eternal format staples like Cephaloid Coliseum now being printed in through Modern Horizons 3, having access to a lot of classic Dread staples like the Creeping Chill, Stinkweed Imp, Silver Smoke Ghoul, Dredge is really kind of on its own, and Faithless Looting is really defined out by its flashback. Now this definitely is available in Pauper, but because this is more a card about speed, you're drawing 2 cards, discarding 2 cards, you can flash it back. It's so much enabling for 1 mana. Not only are you able to draw 2 cards, those draw 2 are probably going to be replaced by Dredge, so you can dredge 2 separate instances. So if it was 2 Stinkweed Imps, you could dredge 10 potentially, 1 card, and then just discard those 2 cards back again. You could discard the Imps again, and you're all at it again. So Faithless Looting really defining the more modern era of this. But again, when it comes to in comparison to Pauper, you just don't have those fast payoffs. Modern is where you start getting them. Cathartic Reunion is a separate instance of this as well. Cathartic Reunion is actually really nice because Faithless Looting, if you don't have enablers in your graveyard, you're not going to get the Dredge off the initial draw. So you have to draw 2 cards, then put the Dredgers into your graveyard. And so a lot of times you will see the opener of many Dredge players just start with Faithless Looting, and then they can cast Cathartic Reunion. If they have a 3rd land, they can then flash back the Dredge. Cathartic Reunion is really nice because for 2 mana, as an additional cost, you discard 2 cards. So you already put those cards into your graveyard, then you draw 3 cards. So Cathartic Reunion is really nice that way. If you have Dredgers in your hand, then you're going to be able to take those. If you have like a Prized Amalgam gummed up in your hand, a Silver Smoke Ghoul gummed up in your hand, you're going to be able to discard that along with another Dredger, immediately start going, dredging your deck, filling your graveyard. So Cathartic Reunion, a lot of these red effects that have this additional cost of, drawing, discarding cards and then drawing an equal amount is fantastic because this is 3 instances of Dredge. So really this would be 2 mana, 3 spells, draw 3 spells. You cast the Cathartic Reunion, discard 2 cards. So you're spending 3 spells to draw 3 cards. But now in Dredge, it is Dredge 3 intensive cards. Again, with 3 Stinkweed Imps, this could be Dredge 15. Most of the time, it's probably like Dredge 5 and then a 4 and then a 4, something like that. Something a bit more common. But Cathartic Reunion is really powerful there. The last one is Creeping Chill. And now Creeping Chill out of Guilds of Ravnica. This card, like, don't get it twisted. This card fundamentally changed Dredge across Magic. This was the quickest auto include in any dredge deck possible. Essentially, you know, 4 mana, Creeping Chill deals 3 damage to each opponent, you gain 3 life. Great. When Creeping Chill is put into your graveyard from your library, can't be from your hand or anything like that. Can't be, you know, if there was a way, it can't be from exile back in your graveyard. You may exile it, and if you do, Creeping Chill deals 3 damage to each opponent, you gain 3 life. So essentially, whenever you mill, whenever you dredge, if you put a Creeping Chill into your graveyard from your library by dredging, you will just get a free Lightning Helix. A free Lightning Helix. That means across 4 copies in your deck, in every single dredge deck, you have a free 12 damage and a free 12 life. You are functionally at 32 life every game, and your opponent is at 8. If you find a way to mill out your deck and get to your Creeping Chills, your opponent is at 8 life, you're at 32 life. Creeping Chill fundamentally changed the game when it came to dredge in all formats, making it viable in a whole new way. You just have to find a way to deal somewhere between 8 to 12 damage, and you can get there. And through fetching and shocking, come on, it's a lot less. Creeping Chill, such a powerful card. You hate to see it in your hand, but it's a fantastic card when you can get it enabled, mill these cards away. Creeping Chill, just that free value. Again, highlighting free value and recursion in many ways. It's a spell that is going to be able to cast itself. It's not really casting itself. It's not casting the front side. It is that second paragraph, but you know, kind of casting itself in that free value where you're not doing anything. You're just getting a spell by doing what you want to do anyway. And that again is that one of the facets of the dredge deck. Now, modern dredge, again, you have stuff like the Golgari Thug. Narcomoeba is your next most common one. So Narcomoeba, when it's put in your graveyard from your library, you may put it onto the battlefield. And then you have stuff like Prized Amalgam. If a creature enters the battlefield this turn, if it entered from your graveyard, or you cast it from your graveyard, then you can return Prized Amalgam from your graveyard to the battlefield tapped at the end step. So again, free recursion. Prized Amalgam returning, and then also Silver Smoke Ghoul as a more recent addition to work alongside Lifekin. So if you gain 3 or more life this turn, return Silver Smoke Ghoul from your battlefield tapped. So a lot of times what's nice about this archetype is if you have a Silver Smoke Ghoul in the graveyard and your opponent goes to Solitude like a Prized Amalgam, that's you gaining 3 life. That will trigger the Silver Smoke Ghoul, but then Creeping Chill gains you 3 life. That will also enable this as well. This deck used to play the black 2/1 vampire zombie, I think it was, and it has haste if your opponent has like 10 or less life. I'm forgetting the name of that card right now, but that card enters the battlefield from the graveyard if you played a land this turn. So landfall from graveyard to the battlefield. The problem is it's a 2/1. It's just like you're not running like the life from the loam conflagrate lines anymore. So you used to be able to run life from the loam, dredge 3, green and 1, return 3 lands from your graveyard to your hand. And what you would do with that is that's a great dredge 3, but it's a great way to fill your hand, get your lands back to make sure you can like cast your Faithless Lootings and all that stuff. But you'd fill your hand with a bunch of lands and then cast Conflagrate, red, discard X cards from your hand and deal X damage as you want, divided among any target. So you could kill a bunch of like super weenie creatures or just slam your opponent's face with a bunch of damage based on the amount of cards in your hand. So a lot of times you would go, you know, kind of dredge a loam back to your hand, loam, you know, lands in your hand. You have somewhere between 5 to 7 lands. You conflagrate for red. You discard your whole hand. You're dealing anywhere between 5 to 7 damage usually. Now, Dredge is not using that anymore. It wants to be a lot faster. It's using Otherworldly Gaze in Modern, so it wants to be a lot quicker. And it's also using things like this deck is using Wonder. So if Wonder is in your graveyard and you control an island, creatures you control have flying. So this is a great way to get over top of like chump blockers in a world where energy is at the top deck right now, creating a bunch of weenie tokens. You want to make sure you can get up and over top. We're going to see in older formats where haste might be a little bit more relevant, where you might be putting anger into your graveyard. Cephalid Coliseum, finally, as my last mention, is going to be a great way to have your land work for you, have that free kind of draw 3, discard 3. So dredge 3 times, discard all 3 cards that you dredge. Fantastic on all angles there. Now, the next format is going to be Legacy. Legacy is where we start to get the introduction. I'm not even going to go over the list. Legacy, not yet. Really, you get the introduction of Lion's Eye Diamond. This is, to me, this is what defines Legacy Dredge for me. There obviously are a lot of other cards that you get through the Legacy format, but Lion's Eye Diamond, discard your hand, sacrifice Lion's Eye Diamond, add 3 mana of any one color, activate only as an instant. So 3 mana of any one color. This is essentially like a Black Lotus, but you have to discard your whole hand. That usually is a downside. A lot of times when you think of like, you know, using this in combo decks, you may cast something like a that Hellbent Tutor. It's a tutor, 1 in a black, where I believe you look for a basic, but then if you're Hellbent, if you have no cards in hand, you can tutor for any card. So you play that, sacrifice Lion's Eye Diamond instantly. You know, you're kind of tutoring for anything. You have 3 mana. That's where you use Lion's Eye Diamond more commonly. But in Dredge, this is a great way to just gain 3 mana, discard your hand. Those 3 mana could be red. You can flashback a Faithless Looting. You can flashback a card out of your graveyard. You have 3 mana of any one color based on what's in your hand. Cast whatever. Doesn't matter. It's a fantastic start to Legacy Dredge. The next option that I think really defines Legacy Dredge is Cabal Therapy. That idea of free value, recursion, using cards out of your graveyard, but not really having a cost to it. It's not a cost when you got to sacrifice a creature. You can sacrifice something like a Prized Amalgam. That thing's coming back. That Prized Amalgam's coming back. So Cabal Therapy, you know, it takes a little bit of guessing. If you cast it on the front side, choose non-land card, target player reveals their hand, discards all cards with that name. So a lot of times if you're playing on MTGO, you can do a quick search of someone's username. If they're in Legacy, if they're in Vintage, a lot of players tend to be like archetype specialists. They tend to play like 1 deck at a time. And so you can see, hey, what's their most recent deck? Oh, it's a blue deck. I'm going to call Cabal Therapy, naming Force of Will. Great, you grab a Force of Will out of their hand. They have no days, they have no force negation. You play a Lion's Eye Diamond, you go off. What's also nice about this is if you miss, you don't have that, but you find that there's no interaction, well, you go about your dredge plan, you discard your hand, maybe you get a Narcomoeba back, you go through your deck a bit. Before they even go to your turn, you then sacrifice that Narcomoeba to flashback the Cabal Therapy because you missed the first time. You have information of their whole hand, you Cabal Therapy again to get the card that you really care about, whether it be the turn 1 play, the turn 2 hate piece, whatever it might be, you get the card that you really care about. Now, notably, this is a non-land card. You're not going to be getting Wasteland or Tabernacle or anything like that. Like I'm thinking in older formats like Vintage, you're not going to be getting cards like that. It's got to be the spells itself. But Cabal Therapy, I think, is really defining here. Not legal in the modern format, but 100% this would be played in Modern Dredge if it was printed into the modern format. Now, the next card is a more recent addition, and I really wanted to highlight this as a card that is free value and recursion, something that requires you to cast a spell. But when it comes to something like the Cabal Therapy, that's casting a spell for free out of your graveyard. But this is a recent addition. This came out of the Warhammer 40k decks. This is something that doesn't even come through a Modern Horizons or a standard legal set. This is something that we might see more and more often, right? So Poxwalkers, you know, 3/1 with Death Touch. Curse of the Walking Pox, whenever you cast a spell from anywhere other than your hand. So again, Cabal Therapy with flashback. Think of Dread Return. Cabal Therapy with flashback. You just sacrifice a creature. You're not paying any mana. Return Poxwalker from your graveyard to the battlefield tap. Just like Prized Amalgam, just like Silver Smoke Ghoul. You know, this is essentially the Silver Smoke Ghoul replacement because, you know, yeah, you're still playing Creeping Chill, but it's a lot harder to be able to consistently gain life, but you're going to be able to return these immediately, probably just by getting a Narcomoeba out, sacrificing that to a Cabal Therapy, and then you got your Poxwalkers back a lot more consistently. You can hold different, you know, at different times. You can at will probably have something like a Cabal Therapy left over in your graveyard. You save it. You name any card. Doesn't even matter. They could be 0 cards. You name any card with the Cabal Therapy. They don't need to have any cards. You're still going to get your Poxwalkers back. So really wanted to highlight this as a recent addition to Legacy Dredge because it came out of the Warhammer products. It is not in Modern Horizons 3. This is a Legacy, Vintage, and Commander legal payoff only. Now, if it was legal in Modern, would Modern play it? Maybe. I don't think so. You don't have Dread Return. You don't have Cabal Therapy. It'd be very hard to enable something like this. You'd probably be thinking of flashing back Faithless Looting, flashing back the 1 mana spell that like surveils 3. Maybe. Now, if you think about something like Legacy Dredge as whole, you still see the Narcomoebas, you see Poxwalker, Stinkweed Imp, Golgari Grave Troll is now your more recent addition. This card is banned in Modern, famously banned, unbanned, rebanned because it's absolutely busted, because it is the card that dredges for the most. It is Dredge 6, highlighting that a point in the original article that we were kind of looking over the text from MTG Wiki, where Wizards of the Coast can't really make this mechanic work because it doesn't matter how high you cost these spells, you're really in it for the Dredge 6 part of it. So really powerful in that sense. Notably, don't have any Prized Amalgams in this version of the list. Even if we scroll down here, we largely see Prized Amalgam is not a common payoff here. You got maybe an Ox of Agonis in there, and then you're really looking for Anger to give your stuff haste, and then really you might be kind of milling out your whole deck to then win through a Thassa's Oracle. So you mill out your whole deck, maybe you get a Satoru out, so whenever a Satoru or one other non-token creature enters the battlefield on your control, if none of them are cast, no mana was spent to cast them, this is a great Dread return target. Then you could have Poxwalkers enter, and then you're just dredging more for free, and then you have Narcomoeba, you dredge again, and it's almost like a combo finish to then Dread return Thassa's Oracle, you win the game. So that's what Legacy Dredge is trying to do. Bridge from Below is also another defining card alongside Lion's Eye Diamond. Whenever this banned in Modern, thanks to Hogak Sense, but really is templated like a Yu-Gi-Oh card. This card does absolutely nothing on the battlefield. It is just a 3-mana enchantment with no ability. But it says when a non-token enters, a non-token creature is put into your graveyard from the battlefield. So for example, if you were to sacrifice it to a Dread return or sacrifice it to something like a Cabal Therapy, you sacrifice a Poxwalker, then you create a 2/2 black zombie creature token. Now that of course doesn't trigger the Satoru. This says non-token creature, so let's keep that in mind. But then if you create a 2/2 black zombie creature token, so that creature token doesn't come in tapped. So if you have something like an Anger in the graveyard, you have a big, couple of bridges go off, you're just going to be able to attack in for the win. And whenever a creature card is put into an opponent's graveyard from the battlefield, a Bridge from Below is in your graveyard. Exile Bridge from Below, so you don't really want to be killing your opponent's creatures. Obviously they can block and kind of make that happen. This deck is also playing roughly about like 14 lands, a lot less than the Modern version, but that's because you have the Lion's Eye Diamond. You're really using this for Cephalid Coliseum. Maybe you might cast something like Breakthrough. Again, Legacy Dredge, largely speaking, a lot faster than Modern, but a lot of the same facets come through. A lot of things are maybe different. Things are more free. They're more free. The value is a lot more clear when you start filling your graveyard with Bridge from Below, Poxwalkers, and then you have like a combo finish like Thassa's Oracle. Things are a little bit different when it comes to Legacy Dredge. Now, the last format I want to talk about is probably one of the funniest Dredge lists that you will ever see in any archetype throughout Magic's history. It's Vintage Dredge. Look, again, another situation where I'm not going to go over the list first. Bazaar Baghdad. One of the single most busted, wackiest lands you will ever see in Magic. This card is approximately like anywhere between 2 to 5k, I believe. It says 2k here underneath my camera. This is the card that makes Dredge expensive. Let's just go back on the prices here. Let's go to like tabletop. $9,000 for Dredge. Notice how, Force Negation 200, all Force Wills 200, yeah, place that's a couple hundred. Okay, not that bad though. I mean, if you really take a look at it, okay, that's like $500. Where's the, Bazaar of Baghdad, a place out of Bazaar Baghdad is 10k. That's the list. That's the deck. Notice how everything else is pennies. Vintage is an archetype is a format with the power 9, with the Moxen, with Black Lotus. Like Bazaar of Baghdad single-handedly makes this deck work. Why? It is a land with no mana ability. It just says tap, draw 2 cards, and discard 3 cards. Folks, they're cooking. They did not know. They did not know at the time, but they was cooking with this one. They were cooking with this one. Oh Lord. You can imagine everything I just talked about, how draw is largely replaced by something like Dredge, discarding 3 cards, free graveyard outlet, right? Now you're all immediately thinking this is a free way to just discard cards. What if we have Madness cards? Yeah, there are some cards that Madness for 0. You could discard Vengevines, then discard those Madness cards, get those back. Unfortunately, Vintage is at a place right now with Orcish Bowmasters being a premier threat. You don't want to be playing like weenie free Madness creatures because those just get pinged down by Orcish Bowmasters. So you're not really worried about all that type of stuff. You're just going hard into the graveyard. Going into the list, literally defined by Bazaar Baghdad. This is the only land, and the deck does not work without Bazaar Baghdad. You are literally hard mulling even to 1 to get Bazaar Baghdad. You have Serum Powder in here as well. Anytime you would mulligan and Serum Powder is in your hand, you may exile all cards from your hand and then draw that many cards. This is instead of this is alongside a mulligan. So you get like a free mulligan. It pretty much like by the time you get to like 1 card in hand, I believe the odds are about like there's a 99% chance that you get Bazaar Baghdad. And what's funny is if you're this far in the video, you will see consequently in a couple days, I'm going to be posting a, Vintage Dredge gameplay on the channel, I actually managed to mull to 1 and not find a single Bizarre Baghdad. I was there for that 1%, and you only live the true low lows and the high highs of this deck once you experience something like that. So I'm happy I got it in my very first league. Bizarre Baghdad, the deck only works with that. So you play Bizarre Baghdad, great. You immediately start getting rid of stuff like, you know, your stinkweed imps, your shambling shells, all that stuff, prized amalgams, narcomoebas, you know, prized amalgam making a comeback here. No poxwalkers. Poxwalker tends to be more combo oriented. Again, you have to cast a spell to get that back out, so you need cabal therapies and dread returns. But you are using the dread cards. You're enabling Icarid here, so something like Grief is in the list to look at your opponent's hand, and then you can exile cards like Grief to get back Icarid, which is a 3/1 with haste, and then you exile that at your end step, but you get some kind of free value there. You have Creeping Chills, again changing that math of your opponent is now functionally at 8, and especially in a hyper fast list like Bizarre, it's going to be super fast to be able to enable a bunch of Creeping Chills. Notice how, though, we also are sneaking in 4 Hollow Ones. Oh, this is my favorite. You just sneak, because you're discarding 3 cards, folks. That makes Hollow One free. You're just sneaking in the Hollow Ones. Hey, you have some in your opening hand. Your first activation, your second activation, your third activation of Bizarre is probably when you're like completely empty-handed. You have some in your first couple activations. Throw out a Hollow One or 2. Get out some free 4/4s. That's what I love about this deck. You are never cycling this. You don't have the mana to cycle this thing, okay? But really, what you're doing with the rest of your cards, you'll notice a couple of dredge cards, okay. But I mentioned Grief. That's not a dredge card. That's an interactive piece. We recently just saw it banned in Modern. So why are we thought seizing our opponents for free? I mean, it's getting rid of a card as well. A lot of black cards are dredge, where we could get rid of a Golgari Thug. Maybe we get rid of a Creeping Chill that's stuck in our hand. Okay. Notice how the rest of the slots are literally devoted to recursion and stopping what stops you. 4 Force of Negation, 4 Force of Will, to pitch to themselves, or pitch to the Mental Misstep, or pitch to Prize, or pitch to Narcomoeba. 2 Mindbreak Trap, or sometimes even 1. I've seen the list I was playing 1 Mindbreak Trap and 1 Chalice of the Void. So like you can throw out Chalice on 0 and then people can't cast Moxen. 1 Mindbreak Trap for the combo decks. Serum Powder is there obviously for mulliganing. Noxious Revival is a way not only to, you know, for example, if you discard a Creeping Chill out of your hand, you can put the Creeping Chill back on top of your deck. That's great. But really, Noxious Revival is there because this is a deck full of Wasteland and 1 of Strip Mine being restricted. You have to be ready for everything your opponent's going to throw at you. You're just going to counter the one thing that stops your dredge. You're not countering your opponent's threats. You are countering and stopping the card that stops you, because you will be better than what your opponent's doing. You will be faster, you will do more damage. You just have to stop what your opponent's doing. So if your opponent wastelands you, you Noxious Revival the Bizarre back on top of your deck, because the chances of you drawing a Bizarre are really low if you already had your Bizarre Disordered and there's 3 more cards out of like 52, 51, 50, whatever amount of cards are left in your deck. Really low opportunity. So you want to, you have the Noxious Revival for that. As an ability to put that card back on top. You draw it, play it. It's an uncounterable play. You can't counter lands. You can counter the activation of it, but again, largely uncounterable effect in drawing 2 cards, discarding 3 cards. So you literally have your dredge, you have everything that stops dredge, and that's the deck. It's like you're not even trying to be faster. What I love about Vintage Dredge is it acknowledges the fact that it's so silly that it's okay. It's one of the few decks in Magic the Gathering that is okay to mulling to 1 card. It is okay. As long as that card is Bizarre Baghdad, it can win the game. It can be faster than what your opponent's doing. It can be better than what your opponent's doing, as long as it mulls to 1. And it's all thanks to the backing of Bizarre of Baghdad. And that's what I love about this list. But that's largely going to be it. That's going to be my introduction, a bit of a footnote to Dredge for you. What did you think about the Dredge archetype? Have you played Dredge in Pauper, Modern, Legacy, or Vintage? What do you think about Dredge all throughout? What are some of the similarities that you're seeing that I did not mention? Let me know in the comment section down below. And of course, if I didn't mention something, if I misspoke on something, let me know in the comment section down below. We'll be seeing a bunch of Dredge on the channel this week. My goal is to ultimately go through a bunch of archetypes that exist throughout different kind of constructed formats. That's something that really interests me. I like seeing the evolution throughout different constructed formats. But yeah, let me know what you think in the comment section down below. That has been your introduction to Dredge.